Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I was born in the US, but moved to the far eastern Primorsky territory in Russia to follow a dream. For more info on that, you can check out my profile. This was my first experience after moving to the motherland. It was February 2012, and I was 19. I'd only been in Russia for the last month or so and was staying at the dacha, vacation home of some distant relative my grandmother had contacted and arranged for me to stay with. The house was pretty traditional, lots of wood carvings, lots of uncleared forest, and this great second uncle or whatever he was welcomed me pretty openly. The only strange thing about living with Uncle Mick was the daily steam baths which everyone gathered for. Hotter than hell and more humid than Florida in the summertime, they could almost make you pass out. I had been working hard to save up enough money to move out, and I found an amazing apartment flat in downtown Vladivostok, near the Russky Island Bridge. They have floodlights illuminating the support cables in the colors of the Russian flag every night. It gave the surrounding area a strange aura all night, which I enjoyed a lot. The building was constructed in 1894 out of red brick, and it was smoky and discolored from over a century of soot, ash, car exhaust, and heavy snow. The inside was amazing, freshly painted lathe and plaster, wood trim and hardwood floors throughout, plus updated electrical, internet, and cable TV. The apartment was heated by hot water radiators, which was going to take some time to learn, but they were free to use. In the basement of the building was a laundry room and a storage area full of old furniture left by prior tenants, and I was welcome to take anything from the stash I wanted. This was lucky since I had nothing of my own that didn't fit in 3 suitcases. I spent the next couple days getting my internet and TV hooked up, taking some furniture piece by piece up from the basement, and trying to lay the apartment out in some functional style. The building had an elevator, which looked like some kind of 1920s retrofit, grafted into the skeleton of the antique building. A massive iron cage with ominous accordion doors, and a skinny cab that clanked and buzzed with electricity as it chugged up and down from floor to floor. An older lady, who lived about 3 apartments down from me, on my floor, stopped in to give me a stern lecture on living in such an old building. I expected her to warn me about the plumbing, or that the hot water took a long time to start flowing. Instead, she told me to mount a cross over every doorway and the main door in my flat. She also warned me against taking the old monster which she used to describe the old elevator between midnight and 5 a.m. She claimed that it would malfunction, but only during those hours. It would take you to random floors, or straight to the basement. On occasion, it would even stop between floors and not start working again until exactly 5. She also told me to expect to see a lot of black cats around the building. In Russia, unlike the West, black cats are considered good luck, particularly if one walks up to you without being called, so you see them everywhere. They were also to catch the mice, which she told me were this big, stretching her hands to the size a small dog might be, and laughing hard as if her joke had been worthy of a stand-up gig. That night I went to work at the radio station around 10 p.m. and returned home after 1:30 a.m. Of course, I didn't remember her warning about the elevator and hopped in, taking it up to the 5th floor. The elevator had a lever you had to pull back. Light indicators told you which floor you were on, and you had to push the lever back into place to stop at the proper floor. It took a little practice, but I was able to do it with no real difficulty. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to, and I got off on my floor without a second thought. As I walked down the narrow hallway toward my apartment, I had the sensation that I was being watched. I turned, but of course the hallway was empty. I took several more steps, and once again I felt like someone was there. Actually right behind me. I spun around as quickly as possible to try and catch whoever was following me off guard. There was only air. When I turned to resume the walk to my apartment, I was startled to see one of the building's various black cats standing off to one side of the hall. It was staring very intently at something back the way I had come. Whatever it was, it seemed to be pretty captivating. I walked toward the cat, but it was fixated on whatever it was watching, its head low and one paw raised as if it was ready to charge at any moment. It was a little creepy, the sensation I had just experienced, and now this random cat acting as if something was there. At first, I thought it might have been stalking a mouse, and I looked around a bit to see if I could find one. There were no mice. I was curious, and standing here in this cold hallway, watching a cat, watching air was going nowhere. So I whispered hello, but there was nothing. I tried again in Russian, privet. The cat was inching its way toward the spot in the middle of the hallway between where I stood and the elevator doors. A very low growl was starting to escape its little body. The adrenaline started to flow, as I expected something was going to have to happen. The tension building so thickly in the air, the hair on the back of my neck started to stand up. Suddenly, and completely out of nowhere, a very loud thud sound shook the hallway. Literally, you could feel the vibrations through the wood floors. If someone had driven a car into the side of the building, that might have accounted for it. That's how intense it seemed, but the hallway stayed silent. The poor cat freaked, jumped in a wide arc and disappeared down the hallway in the opposite direction. I took a few heavy breaths and tried to calm down a little. My heart was pounding and my ears felt like they were going to explode. I walked to my door, opened it, and immediately saw what had made the noise. Everything that had been sitting on top of the dining table had somehow fallen off. My suitcases and a heavy wooden trunk I had brought up from the basement to use as a coffee table. They were all on the floor, but not right under the table. More like a few feet away, like someone had pushed them off the edge from the opposite side of the table. Also strange was that as loud as the sound had been, not a single neighbor appeared to have noticed. There were no calls and no sounds of people in the hallway looking for a cause of the massive boom. In the morning, I met a few more of my neighbors on the 5th floor. I asked them each if they had heard the noise from the night before, but none of them really seemed interested in talking about it. A polyclinic dentist who lived in the apartment by the stairs recognized that I had an interesting accent when I spoke Russian. I told him I was from the US and he chuckled a bit. In Russia, we understand these things. Unpack your suitcases, ghosts hate travelers. I had been living in my new apartment for just over a month now and it was still almost totally empty. There was plenty of furniture in the basement to choose from, but I was always drained. I had left all my friends and 98% of my family behind when I moved from California to Vladivostok, and I was desperate to make new friends. This meant a lot of clubs, a lot of bars, and plenty of wandering through city parks and department stores, which are actually closer to what you might call a mall in the States. Every night I'd get home late and I'd be exhausted. I had barely enough energy to throw some food together and collapse in front of the TV to watch some bizarre Russian adaptation of an 80s or early 90s American sitcom. Seriously, that's a thing in Russia. The apartment had some strange quirks, which I was discovering little by little while I lived there. When I first moved in, I walked through the entire apartment with my iPhone and took video to send back home to my folks. My mother in particular was desperate to know I had found a decent place to live. As I was moving through the apartment, there were definite cold spots, particularly in one of the 2 bedrooms and the main living area. Another strange thing was that both of the apartment's 2 closets were still full of the previous tenants' clothing and shoes. One closet had clothing that appeared to belong to an older man, and the other one, an older woman. These were the only belongings that seemed to have been left behind, and when I asked the apartment manager what I should do with them, his equally odd answer was, "It's your apartment now." I tried to give these items away, but people in the building were completely uninterested. The majority of this stuff ended up meeting its end in the building incinerator chute. It was around this same time that, seemingly from nowhere, the stench began. I actually gave it a name because it became a common enough, though entirely random event for the rest of my time renting that apartment. The smell was overpowering, but nothing too specific. I couldn't say it smelled like death or something rotting because it didn't. It had an odd metallic smell to it for sure, and it could easily make you sick if you stayed around it too long. Beyond that, the odor is beyond my powers of description. At first, I simply assumed the crazy lady who lived down the hall was correct. That the building was infested with huge mice and one had died in my wall or under some appliance. So I moved my refrigerator and oven, emptied and searched my cupboards and cabinets, checked the exhaust duct for the stove vent. I even took apart my sink drain. Nothing. No cause. The other very odd thing about this stench was that it seemed to move around the kitchen area. Most of the time, it was confined to the ceiling area over my refrigerator. I'd sniff it out to that spot, but there were no vents or anything that would allow the smell to come through. Sometimes, however, it would be in the far corner of the kitchen. Or, sometimes in the dining room. It would last a few hours and vanish. After a few days of searching, I did finally contact the building's maintenance guy. He showed up, looked around, but of course, as is typical, there was no trace of the smell. The next day, it returned and was just as strong as ever. I called them back, and once again, the odor was gone. This time, however, I refused to allow the maintenance guy to leave right away. I showed him some corroded fixtures in my shower and asked him to work on that, hoping the smell would return while he happened to be inside my apartment. The smell did return, with a vengeance. An overpowering stench filled the entire kitchen and drove me out. My eyes started watering and my throat began to burn the longer I stood there. I ran to the bathroom and brought the maintenance guy with me, who was at a total loss for words at what he whiffed. He told me he had been working in that same building for almost 15 years and never experienced anything close to what we were now being exposed to. The next day, a contractor was called in and the 2 of them removed a section of plaster from the kitchen near my refrigerator. The wall was empty, no sign of any dead thing, nor of any mold or other cause for the smell. They removed a section of plaster from the far corner of the kitchen as well, and it was equally fruitless. After patching both walls, he tried dumping industrial-strength cleaner down my drains. I could tell he was grasping at straws, but I too was desperate for some level of relief. So I stayed silent and let them work the problem through a process of elimination. Several days of troubleshooting and the odor did seem to fade on its own. I assumed the relief came about thanks to the efforts of maintenance and their contractor, so I thanked them both and closed the claim. That horrible smell stayed gone for almost 4 months before manifesting itself again. It always seemed to happen that way. Months of nothing, and then about 1 solid week of grotesque on and off stench which would move around the kitchen. Then as quickly as it had come, it was gone. To this day, I have no idea where the smell came from or what was causing it. I've been tempted to contact the new tenants and see if they're going through the same issues, but sometimes I wonder if knowing would really make things better or worse. Dealing with the strange odor in my kitchen and sometimes dining room was an ongoing issue. I tried chemical deodorizers and scented candles, incense, etc. It always seemed to come back. Then, one day, with no more warning than I did when it started. It was over at least for a few months. The smell was gone and I finally had my apartment, all of my apartment, to myself again. It definitely made me wonder about the building, if it was haunted. My family was pretty superstitious growing up, so it wasn't a stretch. My grandfather used to tell me stories as a child about his home growing up and the strange things he and his siblings would see. I was spending less and less time at my apartment anyway, so it wasn't much of a concern. About 3 months passed without incident. Things were going very well at the station, and I was developing a group of friends. I started dating a woman who worked at the office complex across the street from the station, and we'd catch dinner together several times a week. She would be getting off work, and I'd be getting ready to head in for my night shift on the air. I remember the first night she came over to my apartment very well, as it was the first time I heard a strange noise in the middle of the night. We hung out all night, went to a movie, came back to the apartment and ate, then watched some TV before she went home. That night at around 1 a.m., I heard this strange mechanical buzzing or whirring noise. It was very brief, probably only a few seconds, and I probably would have dismissed it as part of a dream if it hadn't started again a few minutes later. A very high-pitched whirring noise that lasted a few seconds, then stopped cold. I laid there in bed with my eyes shut, trying to figure out if the noise was coming from inside my apartment, or maybe a neighbor. While I waited in the dark, eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next night it happened again, a high-pitched whirring noise. It woke me up, but unlike the prior night, it didn't stop right away but kept going, continuously. I pulled myself out of bed and searched the apartment for the sound, finally tracking it to my bathroom. I had a cordless shaver which sat in a charging dock. I have a sort of scruffy beard and goatee, so I don't shave every day. I hadn't shaved a few days prior to this incident actually, so the shaver had simply been sitting there powered off. There it sat now, however, in its cradle, running at full speed. When I saw it, I admit, I stepped back and a shock of WTF went through my mind and down my spine. I rushed over to the shaver, grabbed it up and pushed the power button to turn it off, but it wouldn't power down. It kept running in my hand. I turned on the bathroom light and turned the shaver over in my hands, trying to figure out what was going wrong. I pushed and held power, and bashed the button over and over again trying to make it power down. I tried plugging it in, I tried taking off the blades, eventually resorting to banging the shaver against the edge of the sink. Nothing would work to silence the shaver. Finally, being the patient person I am, I filled the sink with water and dropped the shaver in. No matter how water resistant it was, after a minute or so it was overtaken by the water and finally fell silent. I actually left the shaver floating in that water overnight and made my way back to bed. The next morning, I took the shaver and the charging dock and threw the entire mess into the trash chute. I met Lydia and we went to the local gum, closest thing would be a shopping mall in the States, to buy a new shaver among other things. We returned to my apartment late that afternoon and she asked if she could stay over while I went to the station to do a night shift. We hung out for a while and eventually I left her there while I went to work. Before I left, however, I set up the new shaver and charging dock in the bathroom so it could begin its initial charge. When I returned around 3 a.m., I was surprised to see Lydia still awake. It seems that at some point in the evening, the shaver had powered on by itself and she couldn't get it to shut off. She ended up putting it in a drawer so it could run until the battery died. I took the shaver from the drawer and powered it on and off several times. It seemed to work normally. Lydia suggested it was defective and I should return it in the morning, but when I told her I had thrown away my other shaver for behaving exactly the same way, she didn't like that answer. Actually, she refused to come back to my place for at least a few weeks. The apartment always seemed to act up around her as well. Light switches, which would work perfectly well for me, would glitch when she tried to turn them on. She'd flip the switch and the light would come on, but then immediately turn back off again. She'd have to flick the switch 4 or 5 times before the light would come on and stay on. I called building maintenance countless times trying to fix it, but the problem would always come back after a few days. She was a trooper though, and she did stick it out, even if the apartment played these little tricks on her. She eventually moved in with me on a part-time basis. The strangest stuff, however, didn't start until after our next-door neighbors moved out of their apartment a couple years later. That was the craziness that eventually made us pack everything and move. Life in Russia was a lot like life in the US. The similarities between the way people spoke, what they said, how they dressed, what they liked to do for fun, was pretty much spot on. There were some odd differences that took way more time to get used to than I was happy about. One time, I went to the corner convenience market to grab some milk for cereal and tea. A relatively simple act. Normally, yes, however not in Russia. It turns out there are 2 kinds of milk, both widely available and usually located right next to each other in any beverage or dairy cooler. Both are called milk or moloko. However, one is nastelnoy and one is turtoy. The bottles look pretty much the same, they even both come in whole cream or 1.5%. So I purchased some milk and poured it over my cereal one morning and took a bite. I was instantly greeted with the most sour, curdled, revolting sensation I've ever experienced. My eyes teared up, my nostrils flared, and I had to rush to the sink to expel my breakfast before the floor could greet it first. Nastelnoy is table milk, and that's what people in the US would put in tea or on their cereal. If only I had purchased that. I had bought turtoy milk, which is intentionally soured with additives such as vinegar. That's right, the Russians love a good sour milk to drink while on the go. The stuff is a little like sour cream, but liquid. Another odd quirk is that the younger generation does not stay put for very long. People in our building were constantly moving in, moving out. They'd find a better flat at a slightly better rate and they were gone. I guess no one ever bothered to calculate the costs associated with moving. I was well into my 2nd year living in Vladivostok. Things were going great. My girlfriend was finally moving into my apartment while we looked for something bigger that we could afford with our new combined income. Her place was a tiny studio near the factory district, so it wasn't really a candidate. The strange phantom odor that seemed to plague the flat still cropped up from time to time, but we soon discovered that incense seemed to drive it away. It also masked the smell quite nicely. Directly next door to me lived an amazing couple who were in their early 30s and who spoke some English. We hung out quite a lot when I wasn't sleeping from my crazy hours. Practically every other night we'd go out as a group to the cinema or shopping districts and spend hours together. 2 months after my girlfriend moved in, they moved out. It was more than a little devastating. They were the perfect neighbors, and although they did shuffle around a lot at night, it was usually just some low, muffled bumping noises. Who knows how loud a new tenant would be? We never got to find out. Shortly after they had completed the process of moving out, we began to notice strange sounds during the middle of the night. The same low, thumping, dragging noises could be heard through the wall from the apartment next door. At first, we thought they might be contractors, working to get the apartment rentable for new tenants. However, the noises seemed to go on all night. I was usually gone until very late at night, and when I did get home, I was so exhausted no amount of thumping through a wall was going to keep me up. My girlfriend was another story, however. She'd toss and turn all night, eventually moving out to the living room to pass out, trying to get as far from the shared wall as she could. We eventually complained to the apartment manager, who took us immediately to the vacant flat. Of course, the place was completely deserted. My first thought was mice or rats. After all, I'd been warned from my first day living there that dog-sized rats were common in the building. Traps were set, and a small digital video camera was placed, the idea being that if a vagrant was breaking in at night, the manager could show it to police. 2 or 3 nights passed, and as usual there were plenty of bumping and dragging noises coming from the apartment next door. Each day we would all enter the apartment and check the traps, nothing. We'd check the camera, and while it did seem to capture some of the noises, there was no indication of where they were coming from. After about a week we'd had enough and finally convinced the apartment manager to give us a copy of the key. We planned to wait until the noises got to their loudest, and run into the apartment to confront whoever was banging around all night. We didn't have to wait long. The noises started at around 8:30 p.m. and got steadily louder. At about 10 p.m. we sneaked into the hallway and unlocked the door, turning the lock very slowly to avoid making too much noise. There was a fire escape, and we were sure that if the occupant was alerted, they'd be gone before we could get there. We swung open the door and flipped on the overhead lights. Nothing. Not a thing. No noises, no movement, no activity at all except for the lone camera on a tripod to one corner of the room. My girlfriend was looking a little ragged, and truth be told I wasn't in great shape either. The lack of sleep was putting incredible pressure on her and, in turn, on me. We actually ended up renting a hotel room for a weekend just to get away and give my poor girlfriend a chance to sleep through the night. Before going home, we made arrangements to meet up with our friends, the former tenants of the apartment which was causing us so much trouble. We met up at a cafe and went over the entire story from start to finish. By the end, our friends had a look of shock and a little fear in their faces. I still remember exactly what they said next. It was freaky enough to make us pack up that night and go back to the hotel for good.
Those sounds you heard, we know them well. But they were not coming from our apartment. They came from yours. We heard them every night. It kept us awake, and that is why we moved. The walls were too thin.
It took several weeks to terminate our lease at the apartment complex. We only returned to the flat for brief visits to collect belongings. As neither of us had really provided any furniture, that wasn't a big deal. Clothing, electronics, some decorative junk we had collected together to enhance the space was all we needed. While we fought with the apartment manager over our last month's rent, we were staying at a small hotel by the waterfront. It was off-season for tourists, so the prices were reasonable, but still taking their toll as the time we spent there dragged on and on. As the fall season arrived, we were invited up to the dacha summer house of my girlfriend's grandmother. It was in a medium-sized village north of the city and easily reachable by train. We both figured it would be a great escape from the stresses of the city and our prior apartment, so we accepted the invitation, and by the third week in September we were off to Grandma's house. I'd stayed in a dacha before, and they're usually pretty similar. A small wooden cabin or cottage, often with a thatched roof, really intricate carved woodwork, and dense ancient forests sprawling all around. Lydia's grandmother didn't have a dacha, she had a mansion. It was obviously built in the same style, but it was 3 stories tall and had at least 15 rooms. Imagine a log cabin on steroids, with hand-carved posts and massive, beveled glass windows, and you'll have some idea. The first thing I noticed about Babushka was that she loved American music. She talked about it for hours on end. Elvis in particular was one of her favorites. Next was that she likes to flirt with her granddaughter's boyfriend a little too much. She was grabby and spouted off weird innuendos and dirty jokes like no 78-year-old I'd ever met before. The first night we were there in her home, we told her about our experiences in the apartment building. She didn't seem fazed by it, nodding and smiling and agreeing with a lot of our comments. When we had relayed most of the story, she stopped us, pausing to look deeply into the fireplace like she was examining the flames for some deeper meaning.
You know, this house is haunted.
She said to us. I'm not really sure what Lydia was thinking, but I was thinking. What? Why would she say that to us after what we had been through? Babushka began to tell us a story about the weeks just before her husband died. She had a small collapsible tray overloaded in medications necessary to keep her husband alive. The tray was set up near the head of the bed on her side, so she could quickly access them if needed. Often, before she would go to sleep, a figure would come into the room from the door just past the foot of her bed and stop, staring at her. She said the figures were always children and they wore traditional Cossack costumes, probably dating from the late 1800s. 1, 2, sometimes 3 of them would come in standing side by side and cautiously approach the foot of the bed, sometimes stopping and placing their hands on the top of the footboard while they stared intently at her and her husband. She would call out to them, asking what they wanted, how she could help them, but they would never respond. She said the encounter always ended the same way, with her trying to wake her ailing husband, and when she turned back to the foot of the bed, they were gone. One night, they came again, and she was so frustrated and frightened by their regular appearance that she shouted out at them.
Leave me alone. Be gone from here.
She shouted to us while she told the story, gesturing with her hands. The tray, overloaded with medications, then slid across the floor half a meter and came crashing to the ground, pills and bottles flying everywhere. That was the last time she saw the children, and her husband died less than a week later. She had several more stories as well, slowly recounting them as she tended the fire and occasionally took a photo from amongst the many that sit on the shelves around the living room. She would point to one and explain how this relative, or that relative, had returned to speak to her, or how they themselves had witnessed something strange in the dark Siberian forest. She told us about her own brother, Lydia's great-uncle, who had been working for the civil militia in the 1960s guarding train depots. He would come home almost nightly with strange tales of various things he would see while alone in the dark station houses. Phantoms of long-dead passengers, queuing up in line to take their tickets or move across the platform to their train. He would hear the whistles of steam engines that hadn't run for 30 years, hear people whispering, and even said he would suddenly fall ill during his watch. Babushka told us how he would find belongings, artifacts along the train lines. Watches, eyeglasses, rings, lighters. At first he would bring them home, but after a while runs of bad luck would convince him to return the items back to where he had found them. When he had finally been removed from train duty, he had sworn he would never step foot in a depot again. The stories were frightening, mysterious, and even more so the way they were told. I looked around the large living room of her dacha at all the objects on the walls and in the cupboards, dancing in the firelight with large, oversized shadows, and I admit I was terrified. Throughout the 1800s, Siberia was a favored place for the Russian government to send its undesirables such as illegitimate children, even with royal blood, and vagrants. She said once the Trans-Siberian Railroad was completed, the trains ran day and night, carrying poor souls exiled to this region. Lydia interrupted her grandmother, scolding her for making up stories and trying to scare us. Her grandmother just smiled back, fluffing up her blanket and rolling her eyes. Tak malad, she said a couple times while shaking her head. It was my first real introduction to the dark, gothic, superstitious way of thinking that most Russians in this part of the world held. Babushka then continued, saying be careful and that the dead are envious of the living, that they will do almost anything they can to feel warm again. The scene was pretty surreal, but so very, very Russian. If I had grown up in this region, I probably would have been taught from an early age about how to ward against evil spirits and phantoms. I would have been told that they were all around me and that every ancient forest throughout the country was a place where they gathered. I was just about sick to my stomach when Lydia's grandmother stopped and stood up, going into the kitchen and returning with a freshly baked pumpkin, stuffed with fruits and nuts.
You want some dessert?
She chuckled as she offered us some. I wasn't very hungry, and suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Strangely though, Lydia got an excellent night's sleep. Odd what people can take comfort in.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.